I'm Carrie Cassio, Chair of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee. Our presenter today, Flora Shrode, is Science Subject Librarian at Utah State University Libraries, focusing on biology, chemistry, and geology. Flora will talk about her experiences putting together the Sudden Selector's Guide to Biology Resources, and will also give advice on being a new selector in an unfamiliar subject area. If you have questions for Flora, please type them into the question box on your screen, and Flora will pause occasionally for questions. Also, please note that today's session will be recorded, and you will receive an email with a link to the recordings and a copy of the slides shortly after the conclusion of the webinar. We don't currently have a chat function in the GoToWebinar software so that you can talk to other attendees, but if you'd like, please feel free to use the Twitter hashtag ALCTSCE to talk further about today's session online. There may be a slight delay now as we turn the presentation over to Flora.
Hello everyone, I'm pleased that you're here today. Whoops, sorry, I got to get my slideshow working properly. I thought I'd tell you a little bit about myself before talking about the book, but I hope that I convey some of the gist of what the book content is to you today, and maybe you'll be inspired to buy your own copy. I didn't dedicate the book, but I want to dedicate my work here to my role model, Mary Daniel, who was director of the Ag Vet Med Library at University of Tennessee. She's the reason I'm a science librarian today, and also a professor who was an excellent science mentor, Mary Ann Handel, and she's part of the reason why I'm a librarian, because she was such a good scientist. I saw how hard that might be, and I wasn't sure that I could manage to get the grants and be a good teacher and a good researcher. So I majored in zoology many years ago, and I worked in a lab that was a mammalian male fertility emphasis place, which meant that I killed a lot of mice, and it was getting a little brutal, and I really wanted to look for another path where I could be involved with science, but working more with people. I view the profession as a science librarian as a wonderful way to stay in touch with what's happening in the fields, but with a different emphasis of being a teacher and a colleague to professors. I had planned to use a poll for this webinar, but I didn't get that submitted in time. But I am curious about all of you who are listening out there. I'd like to know what kind of library you work in, and of course you can answer that however you like, and also your role there, and if you already work with biology, or if you would like to, or if you're just curious. In writing the Sudden Selector's Guide to Biology Resources, I mostly had academic librarians in mind because that's what I'm most familiar with. I do hope that others would find it useful, perhaps in the large public library or even a high school, if you're trying to build a biology collection for people, readers. In my experience, I didn't do high-level research, so I don't feel like I'm a biologist really by any means. But over the years, I've learned a lot of the vocabulary and become conversant with a lot of the specialized work that people here at Utah State University do, certainly. And I can't stress enough that simply talking with your library's users and your biologists in your community and exploring the literature are tremendously helpful and really the thing that you need to do in order to get up to speed as a biology librarian. I would say don't be afraid to ask dumb questions of if you're in an academic world, of the professors, or if you're working in another situation with biologists. As you know, people always appreciate others being interested in their work, and you can learn a lot just from lots of conversations. Many times in the academic world, a faculty member might not realize they have a librarian or a dedicated liaison who's interested in their information needs and who can buy things that they want. So it's important to spread the word about your presence and the options that you have. And perhaps in public library, people may look to you for reading recommendations in biology, or maybe they need to know that you have a budget to buy books and that you can help them out. Again, at USU here for a few years, my conversations with faculty centered on reviewing journals for cancellations, and that was always kind of a grim time of year. But for the last 3 or 4 years, we've been really lucky not to have to cancel journals, and we've managed to buy back files of e-journals thanks to our university president and provost understanding that if they are going to push faculty to be successful researchers, the library is a key part of the infrastructure for that. At our campus too, we have a patron-driven acquisitions program. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that idea. In our case, if a person requests a book via interlibrary loan, we assess the request to see if perhaps we should just buy the book. And so far, in 2 years of the program, we've only bought about 300 total titles, and of those, only 2 or 3 have been biologically oriented. So apparently, you know, that's not a strong means for my collection building, but it could work differently in other situations. And it's a continual challenge to know if I'm spending money on the right things. In the first chapter of the Sudden Selector guide, I talk a little bit about the range of what biology encompasses, and I'll return to that in a minute. And I also suggest some books that you might want to read that are sort of just a few examples that I've enjoyed to get a feel for different aspects of the discipline. Of course, you can surf for new books. I surfed the web to look for best books in biology or recommended reading or layperson's biology guide. Those are ways to find other newer things. The things that I've listed are a little bit dated, but in concept, not much has changed for most of what I've included. Let's see. And I wanted to mention, when you are working with the community of biologists, you should try to ask them, do they want books about the things that they work on all the time? Or, as we learned here from another department, the faculty wanted books about the areas that were not their specialties, because that's what they needed help keeping up with. And also they wanted their students to read. So again, with communication, I think talking to your primary library audience is key. Here are a few books that you might appreciate if you're new to biology and you want a really easy to handle approach. These very short introduction series from Oxford University Press has become a favorite of mine. You can see I stole Amazon's book covers here. Another recent title, you may have heard about, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. That gets into ethics in medical research and tells the story of that woman who had cervical cancer, and some of the cells from her cancer live today. They're immortal because they keep them alive for research purposes. And if anyone listening has a suggestion of a book that you've come across that's good for learning about biology, feel free to share that title. Returning to the idea of the range of biology, I've listed another set of subdisciplines here. All these words are, of course, familiar to us. We hear them in the news and things like that. And of course, there's lots of interaction or overlap amongst these fields. For example, biodiversity and conservation and ecology and environmental science all go together. And in many cases, I find the biologists I work with do both, I would call it macro work, in the sense that they might be out in a field collecting organisms or measuring plant growth, but then they also have a micro component to what they're investigating, because they then do a lot of biochemical or genetic work to look at DNA and the effect on genes and chromosomes of conditions out in the larger world. With time, as you're working with biologists, you'll get a feel for the characteristics of how different specialties operate and communicate. Most of the folks that I know, and amongst the faculty and grad students, very much embrace electronic publication formats. Of course, they love the e-journal convenience, but it's never wise to categorize. I mean, we can't say that older people or younger people as a group operate one way or another. There's highly individual patterns that you'll learn from your community. So still on this idea of, if you don't know much about biology, how can you start learning? This Science Daily website is probably something you all have seen, and it certainly has a lot of biological related material, and lots of medical stuff here too. I neglected to say earlier that the medical and clinical sciences definitely, of course, overlap with biology. You can see the sections here with articles, mind and brain, plants and animals. Those would probably be some that we would want to look at. Science Daily reports on published research and often will indicate where some research was published. I'm just sort of here looking at the news category of Science Daily. And at the moment I'm thinking of learning about biology, but this also would fit into the idea of current awareness and staying up to date with what's happening in the field. So let's see, I think I picked an article called Fish Are Warmer and Responding to Climate Change. That's just the lead in on this screen. Let me keep going. And then in the text of that story, Science Daily, the writer there has indicated that the research by this person at McMaster University was published in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And just as a side note, I worked with a general education class here, which is mostly taken by freshmen and sophomore, and is supposed to include an information literacy component. And the teacher and I developed an assignment where we asked students to go to a news source like Science Daily, or could use the New York Times, and find a story that reports on published research, and then find that journal article, and then answer some questions comparing the nature of the writing. And mostly our idea was just to open the undergraduates' eyes to the world of journal literature. And of course, seeing things like this is useful for a new biology librarian too, because you'll start to see the range of journal titles in which this kind of work is published. Another similar science news is probably something you may have heard of. It has been a weekly print magazine, and the website, of course, is updated more often than that. Often the science news stories seem to be a little bit longer and a little more detailed than Science Daily. I think Science News hires more highly trained science writers to do their content. And there again, this one summarizes research published in journals. So it's easy to read language, targeting just an average adult reader, so you don't have to have a lot of technical background to appreciate the content here. So if you are assigned to be a biology librarian and you're dropped into a collection, I hope, obviously a first step would be to look around and browse. And it's kind of funny that I picture librarians roaming in the stacks in their print book and journal collections, but nowadays, obviously, with e-journals and e-books, if not dominating, certainly growing in most libraries, it'll change the nature of what browsing means. It might mean spending time in a library catalog more than in a physical space. In most cases, I think a new biology selector would be succeeding another librarian. So if possible, if you could talk with your predecessor, that could be very enlightening and might be a really super efficient way to quickly learn about the nature of your library user community and what they want in the realm of biology. Obviously, the predecessor may have moved to some other organization, but it'd be great if you could get in touch with them. And also learn about personalities of people in your community and who is more or less open to communicating with the librarian regularly. Another situation might be if you have colleagues who are working with other fields of science. Obviously, they could help a new biology liaison learn about how the library operates for collection development. And then seeking out opportunities with the science and technology section of ACRL or other groups in special libraries that have lots of Special Libraries Association, lots of subgroups. Of course, making friends and building a network of colleagues is wonderful, and then a phone call or an email can help you answer some questions. In the book on pages 9 and 10, I list a few examples of some online research guides that I find to be especially thorough and useful for pointing out what our major database is, or some of them list new books acquired by their library. Some of the schools I looked to were UC Berkeley and University of California, Irvine, Duke, and Tufts. Those are just to name a few. And in many cases, these pages were built with the LibGuides software, so that's a place that certainly you can surf the web for LibGuides and biology or other synonyms like biological sciences or life sciences to get some ideas. And we're fortunate to be in this generous community of librarians. You will find that people are often happy to share. You can borrow the style of a LibGuide or some text that's there. Also, when you're learning what's happening biology collection-wise in your community, you might look to see if a faculty member on your campus or a person in your community, if you're in a public library, has published anything. They might have published a book in biology. Talking to an author like that can be really educational. You could ask about their motivation for writing the book, or perhaps any feedback that they've gotten. I show here a title about woody plants of Utah. Obviously, since I'm in Utah, that's something that appeals to us. And Leila Schultz listed there amongst the authors, works here at USU. And in this case, it happens also to be published by USU Press, so this is very close to home. but I noticed the date, and it led me to be curious about whether there had been earlier editions and how radically updated was this. So it was kind of interesting to talk with Leela about that. In the Sudden Selector guide, I list a few guides to the literature. I'm pretty sure each of these does appear in there. It may seem a little old-fashioned to turn to a guide to the literature. A lot of those, or most of those that I know of, are print books. There may be some ebook editions out now, and maybe it's the dinosaur in me, but I really appreciate their style because all contained in one book are recommendations for all kinds of titles that you might want to buy for your reference collection or the regular collection. Also, often there will be a discussion of how the people in the field, for example, ecology or biochemists, or on the screen here, plant biologists, how they operate in their research and what are some patterns in how they publish or specialized databases they need. Or, for example, a guide to literature would help you understand how botanists over centuries have used herbaria as essentially libraries of plant material to help them study. And pretty different from, say, a database of genetic sequences, DNA sequence or protein sequence, compared to an herbarium. Pretty different, but you want to know about these different approaches that the specialists use. Here was another question. I wondered about your collection patterns so far, whether you work with biology now or otherwise. In my library, we're very much moving toward buying a lot of or electronic books. And at Utah State University, we have a growing population of distance education faculty and students, which probably true for some of you too. And ideally, with an ebook, they can have equal support from the library as the students who can walk in our door. We are struggling with the proliferation of platforms and options with ebooks. PDF is kind of, we understand that. Other sites that only allow viewing or printing a chapter at a time sometimes are a little frustrating. Kindle apps. We just got a system called Overdrive that has its own app. So it's been a little a learning curve for us. I bought about a third of the titles that I bought for biology last year as ebooks, and I'm looking for feedback. I'm trying to get some data on how many downloads or checkouts, if you will, those have had. And so far they seem to be getting a lot of use, so I feel like I'm choosing the right titles. So a new librarian obviously needs some guidance on where to start. And I recommend resources for college libraries. I happen to edit the biology section of that, which I started doing in 2008. This source evolved from a title called Books for College Libraries that began in the 60s, and I'm not sure how often that was updated. I think every few years. This can be sort of a core collection place to start. You could use the list from biology to compare to the titles in your collection. I just opened the browse screen here. There are about 2,400 titles here, and emphasis is on print books so far, but we are moving to include more ebooks, and there also are a lot of websites recommended in here. You could start with the lists from this database to see what is in your library and perhaps maybe fill in some gaps. Every year we do try to enter new editions that have come out of books or textbooks. There are some old things in here because part of the point as recommending a core collection is to include some classics that we would like to think that every biology collection would have. The revision is annual, but over the course of the year we can always be editing it, and this system that now lives on the web is a vast improvement over the earlier version. I hope that you'll find it user-friendly if you decide to subscribe. Another thing a new librarian might consider is finding out if you can get maybe even just a temporary subscription to OCLC's WorldCat Collection Analysis tool. We had that for a while here, unfortunately no longer, but we used it to size up our collections and compare them to other schools just to try to see if we seem to be keeping up with our peers, or perhaps if you are in an academic world and you might have other libraries nearby and you might make agreements where one library is going to emphasize plant science more than zoology and animal studies or something like that. The WorldCat Collection Analysis could help you see how the breakdown is going. Now we had resources for college libraries was a list to get started. Choice reviews, reviews online. I have a extra 4 in the title. I rely on Choice really heavily, and I hope it's familiar to many of you. It covers all fields, but it seems to do a pretty good job in biology. The search screen is kind of straightforward right here on the home page, and then if you create a profile you can log in, and that's where you can use those tabs that say My Profile, My Monthly Reviews. I use the My Lists a lot since I do select for a couple different areas: biology, chemistry, geology, and also the reference collection. I can use different lists to keep myself straight on what books I'd like to consider buying. And it's really nice that I have all those funds, because I'll admit that I do update biology in the reference collection from time to time too, and that's fun. Choice comes out monthly, and there's a newsletter that you can receive that also you can receive a customized list of new titles in whatever criteria you have set, whether by subject or maybe readership or reader audience. You can use call number ranges, or you can also refer to the reviewer's recommendation. When you review for Choice, you can declare that a book, you think it's essential for all collections, or you can call it highly recommended, or you can even say not recommended, although I see that very rarely, and I suspect that maybe the overall Choice editors don't often include things that aren't recommended. I've opened the advanced search here just to show you, scrolling down through the subject headings. The way biology is presented is pretty broad: general, botany, and zoology, but I use that and I choose the readership level of upper division and lower division college students, graduate students, and then there are a couple more that you can't quite see on this screen. Over on the left on this advanced search screen, you'll see OAT for Outstanding Academic Titles. That'd be another great place for a new biology librarian to start. You could open the list and see what are the recently added outstanding titles, or go back a few years and check your collection to see if you need to buy some of those. I really like that and find that quite useful. Now, you know, this first bullet shows a firm grasp of the obvious. I think if you know any biologists, you'll know that journal literature is key. The biologists here at USU certainly rely on journals and read them much more extensively than books. Not to say they don't read books, but journals are really the currency for information. You probably have seen Library Journal puts out a periodicals price survey every year, and in the 2012 survey, biology ranks 4th after chemistry, physics, and engineering in the subset of science disciplines that LJ looked at. So the average journal price 2012 for biology, $2,281. Chemistry was the highest priced at $4,227. So it's not trivial to try to build a journal collection in biology as far as a budget goes. In the Sudden Selector's Guide, I took a stab at developing a core list of titles, and it's kind of a tricky, because of course other people might have different opinions about what would you call core. I did start by using Magazines for Libraries as a guide. That's a very useful source for getting a starting place to see what are titles that at least the people who put together Magazines for Libraries think are important for a collection in the dozens of disciplines that Magazines for Libraries covers. And then I also tried to comb through the Thomson Reuters journal citation reports to get the impact factors, just to look at what were the highest ranked titles in the subdisciplines that includes from biology. And of course there's a lot of debate about impact factor and how reliable it is and all that sort of thing, but I wanted to include that in my list building. And about 250 titles are what I came up with, and I categorized them in the book as general biology, which if you're in a smaller library, it might be good to aim to try to subscribe to those titles. Another subset is biochemistry and molecular biology, biodiversity and conservation, and then biological classification, as in taxonomy and systematics, biophysics, botany, cell biology, developmental biology, ecology, genetics, marine and freshwater, mathematical and computational biology, microbiology, mycology, which is fungi and yeasts, physiology, ornithology as a subset of zoology. So if you buy the book, you can use that list to compare to your collection. Now, I just talked about prices and how highly priced biology journals tend to be. So open access is just, of course, a godsend to researchers who can then read anything that's included in the open access collection, whether they have a subscription to the journal or not, and a godsend to us libraries so that we can provide high quality research content at much more affordable prices. Public Library of Science is one of these open access pioneers you may be familiar with. And I say PLOS. I know some people say PLOS, but PLOS 1, and then there are, I think, 7 subjournals, PLOS Medicine, PLOS Biology, and they call those their flagship journals. And then they also have what they call community journals, just in some little bit more targeted disciplines. And those are genetics, computational biology, pathogens, and neglected tropical diseases. And PLOS does include some non-research content, news from the disciplines, and announcements about conferences and things like that. But primarily, they focus on having rigorous peer-reviewed literature. I believe the website says they accept only 10% of manuscripts submitted, so pretty selective. And they run by a nonprofit organization of scientists. Another key open access source is BioMed Central, which you may have heard of. 241 peer-reviewed journals are provided here. This BMC follows the model where the authors who want to submit a manuscript have to pay fees up front. I was surfing through the list of journals, the different charge for different titles, but mostly around the $2,000 range. And obviously that can be a hurdle for many researchers. It's kind of a labor of love and a gift to the research community when people do publish here. It's good that PLOS titles and a lot of the titles in BioMed Central are getting high impact factors, so that which makes sense because their content is readily accessible to the world, so readers then can cite what they use from there. And that then helps come full circle and encourage authors to want to find the money to publish in these titles. PubMed Central is probably something you may have heard of. It's the repository at the U.S. National Institutes of Health, or NIH, and the National Library of Medicine. They partner to maintain this collection. And so I believe it was 2009 when the Appropriations Act made it a law that NIH-funded researchers are now required to deposit a copy of journal articles that result from their NIH-funded work in PubMed Central. And I think in some cases it's within a year after the publication has come out. The whole idea being that taxpayers in the U.S. Actually support the National Institutes of Health, and then if a researcher gets money from NIH, in essence, we taxpayers have already contributed to that. So we ought to be able to see the fruit of their work in the form of published literature. So as you would enter the role of biology librarian and want to figure out what is it that your library already has, or what things do you want to try to add to the collection, in the Sudden Selector's guide, I tried to surf the literature and using words like collection analysis or collection assessment and other words like collection building, together with the many words that you can use for biology or life sciences or subfields. In fact, one article has to do with constructing a core journal list. Another one talks about understanding information use in a multidisciplinary area of neuroscience. So the two citations I have on the screen here are newer. I didn't have them in the list in my book. But that first one is kind of interesting, this notion of the Mendel syndrome. I mentioned a second ago this idea of impact factor, and I'm probably telling you things you already know when I say that scientists get obsessed about the impact factor of journals where they published, and the whole notion of an H-index that tries to, in a snapshot, show the impact in the form of use through citation that a researcher's work has had. it can be misplaced emphasis to look only at these impact factors. I think biologists are fortunate in that the impact factor is calculated for many of their journals, and certainly their highest profile journals, so that if you're comparing one to another, one researcher, you can get a feel for whose published output has had the greater influence. In many other disciplines, especially the humanities, that's not the case, and the emphasis is more on publishing books, so it's a different challenge. This Mendel syndrome is new to me. I just came across it when looking for some examples for today's webinar. This idea of the effects of delayed recognition on some impact indicators, that some researchers' work might just need more time to get acknowledged by others through citation. So then the value of their work or the impact might be underestimated using the standard impact factor and H index. So it's really important to get a whole picture of a researcher's work. And of course, super hot topics, say the announcement of the completion of sequencing some organism's genetic material or genome. When that happens and people accomplish a project like that, the report of it is hot for a while and really popular, but then after a while people may not cite it so much just because it's not news any longer. So it's important to understand and talk to researchers when they're trying to assess their impact, and be sure that they look at lots of different measures. In biology, I've listed only 5 of the databases. Of course, there are some more out there. Biosis, which is the current web world version of biological abstracts, and I think biological abstracts began publication about in the 1900s. I want to say 1907, and I may be misremembering that date. But the nice thing about Biosis with Web of Science, if you buy it through Thomson Reuters Web of Knowledge platform, the data is integrated such that all of the wonderful citation tracking that Web of Science does is then applied to the articles that are in Biosis journals there. Scopus is probably familiar to many of you. It's actually quite new to me because we've only just managed to pay for it and start subscribing in the last couple months, so I'm still getting a feel for Scopus. I like it, and I like the analytical tools it offers. Again, it's sort of like impact factor, but a couple other measures of how journals, articles in particular journals, are getting cited in the world. I list here the Cambridge Scientific Abstracts Natural Sciences. That is a huge umbrella database that covers lots of subdisciplines. For example, database divisions for aquaculture, genetics, entomology, ecology, nucleic acids research, oceanography, virology, and zoology and some other fields are included in that natural sciences group. And with time, these major databases have begun indexing many more open access journals than they used to. And of course, we just looked at PubMed Central as a major source for open access articles. But it's great to see the open access articles becoming discoverable through these kind of standard databases. The specialized sources, what I mean by that are resources a little different maybe from the literature databases that we librarians often understand very well. NCBI is the National Center for Biotechnology Information, and it has an enormous repository of data, including things like RNA and DNA sequences and protein sequence databases, and it's all integrated with PubMed, so that the records for articles in the literature can cross-link to data that the authors may have provided. They want the world to be able to use that data and do their own analyses. GenBank is also from the NIH, National Institutes of Health. That's their major genetic sequence database, and an annotated collection of all publicly accessible DNA sequences. And every year in January, the journal Nucleic Acids Research publishes what they call its database issue, and it's open access for that issue, and it reports on this GenBank and its contents and how it has grown. For example, if you're looking at the nucleobases, if you want to call those the things that form nucleic acids, I think it's 126 billion bases are linked in the GenBank now. So it's kind of almost incomprehensible, the scope of the little individual bits of data reported in GenBank. So people who care about that would be those doing genetic or gene sequencing studies and trying to figure out how genetic sequence that form the chromosomes in our cells control how organisms develop different traits or how metabolic pathways operate. And as you probably know, often biological researchers will use disease situations or other abnormal conditions and trying to analyze those as an attempt to understand what normal structure and function would look like. The NCBI also offers tools like BLAST. I have listed there. I didn't spell out the acronym. It stands for Basic Local Alignment Search Tool. And so in that case, alignment has to do with how different gene sequences are lined up with each other. And a researcher can use BLAST to take a piece of DNA or a protein that they've developed in their own laboratory experiments and run an analysis that compares that to the sequence databases at GenBank, and BLAST calculates the statistical significance of how closely the sequences match. So if a person is trying to determine if a piece of DNA they have is already known as a functioning gene, they could use BLAST to figure that out, or they might realize that what they have identified or constructed is something new and distinct. Let's see, I list also the ITIS, Integrated Taxonomic Information System. That is an effort to, amongst partners in the US, Canada, and Mexico, to try to have a huge, what would you call it, the authoritative database of species names, because as different researchers do their work, sometimes different names get applied and sometimes not accurately. And the LTER is the Long-Term Ecological Research Network, and I'll get to that in a minute. So I just wanted to give a screenshot from one of the specialized databases. This thing called Entree from the National Center for Biotechnology Information is, as the word Entree implies, it's kind of the gateway to all of the different specialized databases. You'll see things there like Unigene is listed, genome survey sequence, and this can be, when I get in here, I don't even know what I'm seeing because I'm not the genetics specialist, but pretty impressive visually to see how Entree and its sources has depicts genes and the way they interact. And in the genome sources here, it's really kind of cool to look at. They have chicken, and Arabidopsis is a plant, and the mouse, of course. It's kind of interesting to see visually how those things compare. And you'll note PubMed and PubMed Central are right there in the upper left corner. Also books, a number of e-books are made available from the National Library of Medicine. And here just another screenshot example of one of these specialized sources is that Long-Term Ecological Research Network I mentioned. This was established in 1980 to track ecological phenomena in the United States, and there are 26 sites who have researchers participating and contributing data to this site. On the web, it describes it as a collaborative effort involving more than 1,800 scientists and students investigating ecological processes over long temporal and broad spatial scales so that they can make comparisons and learn about climate change, for example, across the whole continent of or the whole United States, I should say. A couple of the sites that are near me are Niwot Ridge and something called Shortgrass Steppe in Colorado. If you go to the LTER site, perhaps you want to take a look at the map and see if you're in the United States, if you live near one of these sites also. So in the Sudden Selector guide, my last chapter has to do with current awareness, and in kind of two senses of that. First, in the sense of with science, and how can you advise biology researchers or people interested in tracking what's happening in the field? What can you recommend to them to read? So, of course, blogs would be a natural way of communicating that we're familiar with in most disciplines nowadays. And I've listed a couple there. One from Nature Publishing Group. And Nature, of course, you've probably heard of, and it's probably maybe the top-ranked science biology journal, I should say, but covers lots of fields within life science. TheScientist.com is a really great tool. Lately there's some discussion there about open access publishing and the future of scientific publishing. Discover Magazine, I may have seen that just on the shelf at the grocery store. Very user-friendly and more along the lines of that Science Daily and the Science News that we looked at earlier. So a scientist, of course, can set up a profile to get news about research journal articles they're interested in. I mean, you could do that too. It's just the type of reading that they might want to do might come from a little bit different source. I've mentioned here my NCBI, which is, again, that National Center for Biotechnology Information. It's just another kind of profile or account. Anyone can make one for free, and it lets you then save searches that you do through any of the NCBI sources, including PubMed, and then you can set up to get alerts when new articles are published either by an author that you want to track or on a topic or based on a search that you've built. And I think in the middle there I mentioned profiles from Choice, which I talked about before. That would be more for the librarian usually, although a researcher who wants to keep track of new books coming out in some topic could have a Choice profile too. So staying up to date with science and then up to date with our world as biology librarians. Again, blogs and out there might be good, and email discussion lists are wonderful for all kinds of purposes. I very much enjoy being on the science technology sections list from ACRL, and if you're probably on some lists in your own specialty or other aspects of librarianship. It's just so great to be able to get help with reference question or ask people's opinion before you take the plunge and subscribe to something expensive, a journal or a database. And of course, you look for continuing education opportunities as a way to stay current with what's happening in the world of biological librarianship. And I've had the good fortune to attend something called a science boot camp that Massachusetts and actually a few other New England librarians organized. They've held 4 of these in the summertime, and what they do is meet on one of the campuses in Massachusetts, either the University of Massachusetts system, or last year it was in Tufts. And then they recruit faculty researchers in lots of fields of science to come and talk to the librarians. And that's really helpful. And they've done a great job of getting lecturers who know how to talk to a group of educated adults, but who are not specialists in their fields. So that's actually the end of my presentation. I wonder if there are any questions, and if you don't want to ask today, I'm happy, of course, to follow up via email if something comes up later, and I appreciate your attention.
Thanks, Flora. We're going to wait a bit here and see if we have any questions coming in. I have a question for you. Do you know, there are book reviews that are published in the back of a journal. How do you keep track of those, or do you usually use Choice for that? What do you do?
Right. Earlier in my career, I thought, that would be the best source because people in the field are usually writing the reviews and I could get a better feel for whether to buy or not. I find that they tend to be more behind, and that's probably not universally true, but often I wanted to know about the book sooner than it got a nice review. Although, of course, blogs and things like the journal Science and the journal Nature and their websites, I think that has come a long way. So what I try to do is set up an RSS feed from the journal site to let me know when a new review has been published. But I really do rely on Choice most. But that may be just because I review for Choice and I've just used it for so long. Good question.
Thanks. Do you have a way for your faculty or staff to make requests? Is there an online form? Do they usually call you directly?
Yes, very good point. On our website, there is a request material link, and it said material for years, which, that's what we librarians say. Lately, we've changed it to request a book, just to be a little bit more straightforward, and also to clarify that certainly they may request a journal, but we can't always buy the journal, and certainly not immediately as they request it. We have to explain their budget, subscription cycle, and all that good stuff. We do also have LibGuides that try to promote subject liaison librarians, and part of the message there is please feel free to contact your liaison. So it kind of just depends on where in the library website world the faculty member or student finds themselves.
Do you ever have to say no to people for books?
Sometimes when the price has just seemed exorbitant, although we tend to buy what people ask for, just because we think if you're asking, it means you're going to read it. And we'd love for more of our collection to be read, which I think might be true for lots of academic libraries and other libraries.
That's very true. I have another question. Do you find that the participants on a list, like the STSL on ACRL, are primarily from medical schools and things like that? Somebody says she found that their needs would be vastly different than what she might need at a regular university library.
Oh, interesting. My sense of that is that more are actually academic. That's interesting. Huh. Yes, sorry, I'm looking at the question on the webinar software too.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a few medical schools, I guess my medical librarian friends whom I've talked to seem to be more focused in on MLA, the Medical Library Association, and probably maybe more active on that kind of list.
Sure. Are you spending less time now choosing biology sources because of the patron-driven acquisitions or PDA programs?
No, in fact, the PDA, I will say it hasn't really taken off in the biology sense. When we reviewed the titles that we bought through that last year, very few from biology. So I'm still combing through to see what I think would be good for our readers, whether they think so or not. Just hoping they'll discover it.
And are those PDAs are for your electronic books, correct?
Actually, some of both.
Okay.
We've gotten print, but trending toward ebooks just because of all the reasons that we do that, so that there's broader access for all of our university's community.
Okay. Do you use the resource Quarterly Review of Biology very much?
Oh, not as much as I should. Thank you for mentioning that, because I should have had that on a slide somewhere here. I appreciate you bringing that up.
Okay. Do you have recommendations of other biology-specific email lists? Somebody says that she belongs to the CHMINF for chemistry, and she'd like to see something like that for other science areas.
Right. I don't know of one that's more a subset of biology librarians. I'd love to know about that if anybody here knows of a more focused one.
I don't know. Another question, have you shifted some of your biology reference materials? You did talk about still purchasing that. Have you shifted them to circulating collection instead?
Right. In fact, one thing we did as of early 2010, I believe, we let our reference books circulate for 5 days. So that was one decision, and I have in fact moved some to the circulating collection and purchased some that you would call maybe a reference type book, but purchased for the circulating collection. Just again, hoping that somebody will find and use all the stuff that we're spending all this money on.
Exactly. Do you have a particular platform that you're using for ebooks in biology? Is there a certain vendor you get most of those materials from, or are you kind of across the board?
We are across the board. We've been lucky to be able to get a huge number of titles from Elsevier and Springer and Wiley, but eBrary is probably our, I don't know, I guess maybe dominant platform, not necessarily for biology. I think I would have to say those other Springer, Wiley, and Elsevier are the primary ones so far.
For those of the people who are on the webinar today who are not at an academic library or don't have access to something like Choice, is Library Journal still a good resource for biology resources?
Yes, indeed. And I should have mentioned, and I'm pretty sure I list in the book, there's a best science books column that comes out, I think, annually in Library Journal. Now, unfortunately, the guy who compiles that, he lists very few titles in several disciplines, so you don't get a lot of biology suggestions from that, but what's there is always good. And yes, the usual LJ reviews are great. I don't review for them, but I know some of the librarians who do, and I trust their judgment.
And for other people who don't have a Choice subscription, those new book alerts, is that restricted to a subscription or no?
I think that is one of the value-added things that you get only with a subscription.
Okay. Well, are there any other questions? We'll wait a moment to see if there are. And I wanted to ask you also, for using things like the open access with PLOS and BioMed Central, do you have a discovery layer for that? Do you point people to it in something like LibGuides? How do you get people to know that those open access things are available?
Right. I do rely on LibGuides here in my case here. They are accessible. We happen to use the Encore system from III, and so we have, what do you call it, connections, pipes to those big open access collections there. But I have a feeling that the biologists are more likely to go through the LibGuide just because I hammer on it so much when I'm trying to meet with them, just to try to remind them that that's a one-stop place to get what really are the best links that are both subscription-based via USU and open access.
Okay, well, I don't see any other questions coming in. If you do have any, you can, of course, contact Flora directly. She'd be happy to answer those.
Yes.
And I want to thank you. So we're going to switch over here for a moment. And I just wanted to thank Flora for all of her advice starting out as a biology selector. It was really very helpful. There were some great resources for all of us to check out, some I didn't really know about anymore. And I work at a science library, but I do not work in collection development, so this was really interesting for me too. Thank you to all of our attendees. I hope you did find today's session useful. You'll get a short online evaluation form after the session. We hope that you can take a few minutes to respond to those questions and return the form to us. The comments that you have are always very valuable to us at the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee and helps us to plan some of our new offerings. Information about all the ALCTS Continuing Education offerings are on the ALCTS homepage under Online Learning. We do have 12 more webinars scheduled through the end of this year. One of them next week, which I think some of you are signed up for, is the Chemistry Sudden Selector series. And we also have online web courses, such as the Fundamentals courses, and a monthly e-forum online discussion. August's e-forum will be Turning Statistics into Assessment. How can technical services measure the value of their services? We're also building our 2013 education calendar, so any suggestions for webinars or other opportunities are always welcome. I'd like to thank Eva Sorrell for providing our technical support for today's webinar, and also Alyssa Novak in the ALCTS office. The support that they and their colleagues provide for us on the Continuing Education Committee's Technical Support Subcommittee make it possible for us to present these webinars smoothly. So thank you again for joining us today, and we hope you'll participate in other ALCTS continuing education offerings in the future.